Hey everybody, my name is Logan Irwin, and I'm doing my project on whether or not brain injuries can impact our knowledge of language. So first, we kind of want to discuss the different types of brain injuries, but before I get into that, I kind of want to explain why I chose this topic. So when I was going through and looking for what I wanted to do, I came upon an article about a woman in China who was 94 years old, and she had a stroke, and she was actually bilingual. And she had been an English teacher in China, but she was Chinese. And when she had that stroke, when she survived it and was beginning to relearn how to speak, she could not speak Chinese. She just forgot how to do it. She'd been speaking it her whole life, but after her stroke, it just affected her, and in ways that she couldn't come back from. So she was only speaking English from here on out. And she said it's a phenomenon that she had never experienced before. It was something like she could not explain. I also chose this topic because I had two grandfathers who both passed away after complications with having a stroke. So I wanted to kind of know more about what the stroke does to the brain and different types of brain injuries, and some are mild as a concussion, and then traumatic that are life altering or life ending. One of my grandfathers, especially after he had his stroke, I realized, and I was able to see firsthand how much he struggled with speaking and language patterns and all of that stuff. So I wanted to dive into it a little bit deeper. So first we'll talk about the different types of brain injuries. So there's traumatic brain injuries, mild brain injuries, strokes that lead to the brain, and then brain aneurysms, many more, but these are the most important ones that we're going to focus on. So this is the statistic that I got from the CDC, and it says traumatic brain injury is a leading cause of death and disability among children and young adults in the United States. So each year, an estimated 1.5 million Americans sustain a TBI, which is going to be a traumatic brain injury. And I thought that was an overwhelming statistic, especially just for Americans. I can't imagine what the statistic would be worldwide. So first we'll start kind of talking about what traumatic injuries are. So traumatic injuries are defined as a condition where the patient has been in a state of unconsciousness for more than 6 hours. So most patients who are going through this are going to be hospitalized and taken care of for a good deal of time after the fact. Speech that is produced by an individual with a traumatic brain injury may be slurred, slower, and in some cases impossible to understand. So maybe they still have that recollection in their brain of what they're wanting to say, they just can't physically say it. Language can also be impacted by sentence formation, lengthy description, lack of understanding, or the inability to remember words. So we may be thinking of something and then completely and totally forget it because we've lost all recollection of what we knew before due to this traumatic injury. Mild brain injuries may result in a patient losing consciousness for 30 minutes or less, or not at all. So a concussion is a really good example of a mild brain injury coming from someone that has suffered 2 or 3 concussions in her past. It is a feeling that is kind of hard to explain. Head injuries like these cause the brain to shake back and forth within the skull, which results in mild damage. So it's really painful to look at light, at your phone screen, things like that. So some symptoms of mild brain injuries include confusion, headache, blurry vision, nausea, and difficulty remembering new information. Language is also impacted if patients have difficulty understanding words that are written or spoken. So the left side of our brains is responsible for language and speech development, and it's the dominant hemisphere of the brain, which is something that I did not know before. And then we're going to talk about strokes for just a second. So strokes occur when the supply to parts of the brain are reduced or interrupted, so the oxygen supply. This stops the brain tissue from receiving oxygen and nutrients, so it's all cut off. It's basically like the brain's not getting, pretty much like food or water. Someone who's had a stroke may struggle to pronounce words correctly because they're having a hard time to get their lips and tongues to form the correct sound. So they're physically having a hard time not being able to get those words out. Language can be impacted tremendously. Patients can develop conditions called aphasia or bilingual aphasia, which we're going to talk about in just a second, which is what really intrigued me. Also, we're going to talk about a brain aneurysm. So a brain aneurysm can occur due to high blood pressure, atherosclerosis. It can be genetic It can be from trauma or abnormal blood flow where arteries come together. Brain aneurysms are fatal in about 50% of cases, which is something that I thought was astounding also. Most deaths stem from massive brain injury from the initial bleeding that's taking place within the brain. So suffering a brain bleed, if that's not stopped in time, the patient is most likely going to die. So those who do survive, around 65% suffer some type of neurological deficit. Speech can be impacted permanently, as well as thinking. Stuttering can occur due to brain structure and motor neuron blockage. Disfluency occurs when this area is damaged, so speech is not fluent, it's hard to understand. Language can be impacted by listening or reading comprehension verbally or through writing, so this is going to impact your hearing, your speaking, what you can recall, what you can write, things like that. It's going to impact a lot of areas. So, when injured, what areas of the brain affect our speech and language patterns? So we're going to talk about that really quick for a sec. So here are some important parts of the brain that we have labeled. So first we're going to start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for many of our day-to-day functions, speaking and our language perception. It is affected when strokes occur. So next we have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is responsible for more language motor skills with focus on spatial awareness. So this is when our speaking and writing skills can be affected. And then we're going to have the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is also a part of the cerebrum, and this area is responsible for language comprehension. So hearing and vision are also affected if the temporal lobe is damaged. Now we're going to talk about aphasia a bit. So this is kind of what got me really interested in this topic. So there's 3 different types of aphasia. All 3 deal with the interference with your ability to speak or understand a language. So we may lose all we've known about a language previously before an injury and not be able to, 1, speak it, or 2, even understand what's going on. So the first type is Broca's aphasia. This type is used to show that the ability to speak may be damaged, but most of the other language abilities like reading or comprehending stay the same. So we can't really speak, but we're able to comprehend and understand. The second type is called Wernicke's aphasia. Individuals affected with this type cannot understand others when they speak or themselves when they try to speak. So I literally was in this position and I thought back to my grandfather, who I was able to go see in the hospital because he was in the hospital for a prolonged amount of time. And I think back to, talking to him, and the nurses would tell us, he can understand you today, or today he can't understand you. And I really was not able to understand that. But I realized, he couldn't understand what we were saying because maybe, his language perception had suffered. He couldn't remember what he had, known all his life because that part of his brain had been damaged. And then the third and final type is known as global aphasia. It occurs when the brain damage is so widespread that both areas associated with the other 2 types are injured. So those who survive global aphasia are not able to understand any type of spoken language or to speak at all. So really, they're just going through the motions. If they're able to do so, they can't comprehend any type of language without having to relearn it, or cannot speak at all unless they are retaught how to speak, which I can't imagine. And then we're going to talk about bilingual or multilingual aphasia. So bilingual refers to someone who, of course, speaks more than one language, and the multilingual refers to someone who speaks multiple. So this type of aphasia can occur when an individual suffers brain injury and may lose what is called their mother tongue and may only be able to speak their second learned language. So like earlier when I was talking about the lady in the article who completely had no recollection of Chinese but was able to have that second language in the back of her mind stored there in the part that was not damaged due to brain injury and was able to speak that. So a majority of the time an accent can even be present, but there are also cases where the language is lost as a whole, such as that woman, and the patient has no recollection of a formerly learned language. I cannot imagine that if I were to, knock on wood, injure myself and wake up and not have any idea how to speak a language I had been speaking my entire life. So let's talk a little bit about brain injuries and the English language. So we're going to revisit our prompt. Have injuries in the past or will injuries in the future affect the history of the English language or the future of the English language? So let's break it down a little bit. The history of the language could possibly have been affected had a mother or father lost their ability to speak when they had a young child in the home. The child may have had no one to help them learn the language correctly, and the child could have possibly picked up another language as their first, or struggled with speech impediments throughout early childhood. The future of the English language could be affected if more injuries were to occur to English-speaking individuals. So they're going to lose everything they learned about English, and, given the chance, I doubt they're going to choose to relearn English since it is the hardest language to learn. Again, just that statistics, traumatic brain injury is the leading cause of death and disability among children and young adults in the United States. So around 1.5 million Americans will sustain a TBI a year. So really quick, we can talk about what would happen if more injuries occurred. Number one, we'd have the loss of the English language forever. Say, a lot of people were, knock on wood, I hope this does not happen, having brain injuries, although it is a possibility. We could possibly lose the English language forever due to the fact that it is so difficult to learn in the first place. I can't imagine having to relearn it. Then you'll have other languages surpass English. So this could be a possibility if someone chooses to learn another language instead of English. And then we'll have speech language pathologists begin to work with patients in other languages. So if you have trained speech pathologists who can teach this patient another language on a simpler route, they will elect to do that just to get them back speaking. The patients have forgotten all they have known their entire lives. So they're going to lose the recollection of everything that they've ever known, and that, I imagine, is very frustrating. And then patients are unable to communicate with anyone, so they aren't able to comprehend, to speak, and we're going to lose someone who did know the English language. So there's a possibility that one day it may not be the most well-known language on earth. And then the written English language can be lost also. It is a possibility that if enough brain injuries were to occur and people began to teach their children other languages, and even if they were learning the English language, I'm sure there's tons of technology out there that makes it easier to understand it online and using things technologically than it is to go back and be rewriting things in English. So, to wrap up and in the scheme of things, yes, brain injuries can affect our speech and language patterns, but there are resources available to those who are injured to hopefully restore what they knew prior to the accident. We've talked about it in some cases. Individuals with brain injuries may forget any source of language, especially the English language that they may have known before, but in other cases, patients know and remember the language but cannot act on their thought processes due to speech restraints from the brain injury. So we have speech and language pathologists, therapists, nurses, and doctors at our disposal to help injured come back from brain injuries, whether they serve as traumatic or mild, or a stroke or a brain aneurysm or whatever it may be. Speech and language pathologists specialize in helping younger children to overcome speaking difficulties and those who have suffered a type of brain injury to be able to rebuild their knowledge and strength of what they could do prior to the incident at the drop of a hat. So I chose this topic because it intrigued me how many people have to relearn the English language, the hardest language to learn, by the way, for a second time. It also intrigued me that many people just pick up a new language to communicate in after the fact of injury. I would like to conduct more research on my own time to see how brain injuries of this nature were handled in previous times throughout the history of the English language. And as far as the future of the English language goes, I am very thankful that we have resources to help us get back on the right track after we damage vital parts of our bodies that are needed for everyday actions. So I got this template from SlidesGo. I want to credit them real quick, and thank you guys for watching my video.